March 1st, 1811, roughly 470 of Egypt's most powerful men are riding down a narrow stone road inside the Cairo citadel, dressed in ceremonial silk, having just shared coffee with the man who invited them there. They are the Mamluk Beys, the last heirs of a warrior caste that ruled this country for over 500 years combined, first as sultans, then as the hidden power behind Ottoman governors. Ahead of them, the gate that leads back out to the city swings shut. Behind them, more gates close. They are trapped in a defile barely wide enough for 2 horses, and the men lining the walls above them are not there for a parade. This is the story of what happened to the Mamluks after that. Morning is after an earlier catastrophe 3 centuries before it. It is a story with an escape by horseback over a cliff, a slave soldier who became Napoleon's closest bodyguard, and a fugitive colony on the Nile that Egypt's own ruler eventually hunted down and erased. Twice in their history, the Mamluks' entire world ended. Twice, some of them found a way to survive it. To understand what was lost in 1811, you first have to understand what the Mamluks actually were, because the word itself gets misunderstood constantly. A Mamluk was not a nobleman's son inheriting a title. A Mamluk was by definition a slave, usually a boy purchased as a child from the Caucasus, from Circassian, Georgian or Turkic territories, brought to Egypt, converted to Islam, and put through years of rigorous training in horsemanship, archery, swordsmanship, and Islamic law. Only after this training was complete would he be manumitted, formally freed and enrolled as a soldier in the household of the emir who had purchased and raised him. This system produced something unusual in world history, a ruling class that was never hereditary. A Mamluk's own sons could not become Mamluks because they were born free, not enslaved and trained through the system. Power had to be renewed every generation by importing a fresh cohort of boys from outside Egypt entirely. It sounds unstable, and in some ways it was. But it also meant the Mamluk elite could never calcify into a lazy, hereditary aristocracy. Each new generation had fought and trained its way into position. The Mamluks first seized power in Egypt in 1250, overthrowing the Ayyubid dynasty that had employed them, and they went on to build one of the medieval world's most formidable states. They stopped the Mongol advance into the Middle East at the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260. One of the few times in the 13th century that Mongol expansion was decisively halted. They drove the last Crusader strongholds out of the Levant. They controlled the lucrative spice trade routes between Asia and Europe, and Cairo under their rule became one of the great cities of the Islamic world, filled with the mosques, madrasas, and mausoleums, whose distinctive architecture still defines the historic core of the city today. By the time their sultanate reached its final generations, the Mamluks were feared across the region as cavalry without equal, respected as patrons of scholarship and architecture, and resented by nearly everyone who had to live under their taxation and their internal power struggles, which were frequent, violent, and often fatal for the men involved. Their destruction, when it eventually came, would not be a footnote. It would mean the end of the last independent Muslim state ruling from Cairo, and the disappearance of a system of government the region had lived under for 2.5 centuries. The first ending came from the north, and it came fast. By the early 16th century, the Ottoman Empire under Sultan Selim had become the dominant power in the Middle East, and the Mamluk Sultanate stood directly in its way. Both states wanted control of the lucrative trade routes, and both understood that only one of them could rule Cairo, Damascus, and the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. In August 1516, Ottoman forces crushed the Mamluk army at the Battle of Majd in northern Syria. The reigning Mamluk Sultan, Kansu al-Ghori, died in the chaos of the battlefield, betrayed in part by one of his own governors, who defected to the Ottoman side mid-fight. Syria fell within weeks. In Cairo, the Mamluk establishment scrambled to install a new sultan, Tuman Bey II, who inherited a crumbling war he had almost no chance of winning. Tuman Bey tried to modernize. He rushed to acquire cannons and firearms in the final months before the Ottoman advance reached Egypt, recognizing that Mamluk cavalry, magnificent as it was, could not simply charge through gunpowder and organized artillery fire. It wasn't enough time, and it wasn't enough technology. In January 1517, at the Battle of Ridania just outside Cairo, the Ottomans broke through. Tuman Bey held out a little longer than expected. He briefly recaptured Cairo in a night assault, forced the Ottomans back, and even had Friday prayers said once more in his own name. But Selim's forces returned in overwhelming numbers, scattered what remained of the Mamluk defense, and Tumen Bey fled south, hunted with nowhere left to rule. He was captured within weeks. On April 13, 1517, the last sultan of an independent Mamluk Egypt was hanged at Bab Zuwayla, one of the great gates of Old Cairo, reportedly left on display for 3 days afterward as a message to anyone still thinking of resistance. The Mamluk Sultanate, 267 years of independent rule, ceased to exist in a matter of months, and that is where most tellings of this story stop. But it's also where the more interesting story actually begins, because Selim made a decision that would shape Egypt for the next 300 years. Rather than exterminating the Mamluk class outright, the Ottomans found it more practical to rule Egypt through them. Selim installed a defected Mamluk commander, Khair Bey, as the first Ottoman governor of Egypt, and over the following decades, a system took shape in which 24 Mamluk Beys, provincial strongmen, still recruiting and training their own household slave soldiers exactly as before, held real administrative and military power underneath a nominal Ottoman viceroy sent from Constantinople. The Sultanate had been destroyed. The Mamluk system that produced it had not. For the next 2.5 centuries, this arrangement gradually tilted back in the Mamluks' favor. Ottoman governors came and went, rotated in and out of Cairo every year or two, while the Mamluk Beys stayed, accumulated wealth, and quietly rebuilt the very autonomy the conquest had supposedly ended. Between the late 17th century and the mid-18th, Mamluk factions deposed dozens of Ottoman governors who displeased them. By 1768, one Bey, Ali Bey al-Kabir, felt strong enough to formally declare Egypt's independence from Constantinople altogether, briefly campaigning into Arabia and Syria before being betrayed and killed by his own former protege. The revolt collapsed, but the message was unmistakable. 3 centuries after their sultanate had supposedly been erased, Mamluks were once again the effective rulers of Egypt, this time operating under a threadbare fiction of Ottoman sovereignty that everyone involved understood was mostly theatre. Then came a second, much faster threat, arriving this time from Europe. In the summer of 1798, a French expeditionary force under a young general named Napoleon Bonaparte landed in Egypt, and at the Battle of the Pyramids that July, French infantry squares and disciplined artillery tore apart the massed cavalry charges of the ruling beys, Murad Bey and Ibrahim Bey, in a matter of hours. It was Marjdabik and Ridania, all over again, an older style of elite cavalry warfare meeting a newer, more industrialized form of violence and losing badly. The French occupation lasted only 3 years before British and Ottoman forces pushed them back out in 1801. But it left Egypt in a 3-way power vacuum among the withdrawing Ottomans, the departing British, and the battered but still armed Mamluk households. Into that vacuum stepped an Ottoman Albanian officer named Muhammad Ali, who had arrived in Egypt in 1801 as a mid-ranking commander and, through a combination of political maneuvering and ruthless calculation, had made himself the country's Ottoman-recognized viceroy by 1805. Muhammad Ali understood something the Mamluks themselves seemed slow to accept. There was no version of modern Egypt in which a semi-independent, self-perpetuating slave soldier, aristocracy, and a centralizing new ruler could coexist indefinitely. One of them had to go. For several years he played a careful game, alternately negotiating with the Mamluk Beys and chipping away at their strength through raids and forced relocations, splitting off portions of their remaining forces and sending them south toward Sudan under supervision he controlled. But this was preparation for something more permanent, not a genuine settlement. And by the beginning of 1811, Muhammad Ali had decided the Mamluks' second and final ending was overdue. The pretext was almost elegant in its simplicity. Muhammad Ali was preparing to send an Ottoman-sanctioned well-sanctioned military expedition against Wahhabi forces in Arabia, and he announced a grand ceremony inside the Cairo citadel to formally invest his son, Ahmad Tusun Pasha, with command of that army. Every Mamluk Bey still resident in Cairo was invited to attend. It was, on its surface, an honor and a gesture of reconciliation after years of tension. Nearly all of them accepted. On the morning of March 1st, 1811, the Beys arrived at the citadel with their retinues, roughly 600 to 700 men in total by contemporary estimates. They were received courteously. They were served coffee, and the ceremony concluded, and the assembled Mamluks formed into procession to leave, moving down the steep, narrow road that descended from the citadel toward the city gates, a road with high walls on either side, built centuries earlier for defense, not for hospitality. As the column of riders reached the gate at the bottom, it was suddenly shut in front of them. Behind them, the gate they had entered through closed as well. They were sealed inside a corridor with no way out, and Muhammad Ali's Albanian troops, stationed on the walls above on his direct orders, opened fire. There was no combat in any meaningful sense. The Mamluks were dismounted, packed into a defile, and cut down by musket fire from positions they could not reach or return fire against effectively. According to the most persistent account passed down afterward, only a single rider, sometimes named as a Mamluk called Hassan or Amin Bey, managed to force his horse up an embankment and leap the walls of the citadel to escape. Though the details of this individual escape are impossible to verify with full certainty and have taken on the character of legend over the intervening 2 centuries, the killing did not stop at the citadel gate. Over the following week, Muhammad Ali's forces fanned out across Cairo and the surrounding provinces, hunting down Mamluk household members, retainers, and relatives who had not been present that morning. Estimates from contemporary and near-contemporary sources suggest well over 1,000 people were killed inside the citadel itself and its immediate surroundings, with several thousand more Mamluks and their dependents killed across the wider city and countryside. In the days that followed, properties were seized, households that had existed for generations, accumulating land, weapons, art, and political influence were dismantled within days. What the Ottomans had failed to fully accomplish in 1517, or the permanent destruction of Mamluk power as an independent force in Egyptian life, Muhammad Ali achieved in a single, carefully staged ambush. For the handful who survived, the questions that mattered most were immediate and brutally simple. Where do you go when the entire structure of your identity, your income, your household, and your protection has just been murdered in front of you? And is there anywhere left in Egypt where being recognized as a Mamluk isn't now a death sentence? In the days and weeks after the massacre, Muhammad Ali moved quickly to make sure there would be no recovery this time. Surviving Mamluk estates across Egypt were confiscated and redistributed, cutting off the class's traditional economic base entirely. Households that had operated almost as private militias for 2.5 centuries were broken up. Wives, children, and extended dependents of the murdered Beys lost not just their protectors but their legal and social standing overnight, and many disappeared from the historical record altogether, absorbed into ordinary Cairo life or scattered to relatives in the provinces. Muhammad Ali's government made no pretense of restraint or mercy in its public messaging. This was meant to be understood as a closing chapter, not a disciplinary action. Circulars and orders went out to provincial officials instructing them to hunt down any remaining Mamluk Beys who had not been present in Cairo that March morning. Several prominent leaders, including a commander named Ibrahim Bey, had in fact been away from the capital and survived the initial slaughter, only to spend the following years as fugitives inside their own country. For those who couldn't hide, flight became the only real option, and the most viable direction was south, up the Nile toward Sudan, then only loosely governed territory, well beyond the reach of Muhammad Ali's administration. A significant number of surviving Mamluks did exactly that, retreating with what forces and wealth they could salvage into the region around Dongola in what is now northern Sudan, effectively founding a small breakaway polity of their own, still led in its early years by Ibrahim Bey, who had commanded Mamluk forces during the chaotic period after the French withdrawal. It was, in a strange way, a miniature repeat of the very first Mamluk story, a defeated military caste regrouping in exile and trying to carve out a new territory to rule. exactly as their 13th century predecessors had once done in Egypt itself. Ibrahim Bey did not live to see whether this new colony could endure. He died there in 1816, worn down by years of hardship, still in exile, still technically at war with the government that had massacred his colleagues 5 years earlier. Back in Cairo, meanwhile, Muhammad Ali used the destruction of the Mamluks as the foundation stone for an entirely new Egyptian state. Without the old beys to contend with, he began building a centralized administration, a modern conscript army trained along European lines, state monopolies over major crops, and eventually an industrial base, the beginnings of what historians often describe as modern Egypt. The public reaction inside Egypt to the massacre itself appears to have been muted, or at least not recorded as widespread outrage. The Mamluks had ruled through fear and taxation for generations, and there is little evidence of popular mourning for a caste, many ordinary Egyptians associated with exploitation rather than protection. The government's official position was equally clear. This was not a tragedy. It was the founding act of a new order, and it would be remembered, if at all, as the moment Egypt's ruler finally seized the country back from its foreign-born slave soldier aristocracy. But for those who had escaped the killing, the story did not end with confiscation and flight. It splintered into several distinct and remarkably different paths, some tragic, some almost absurd in how far they carried surviving Mamluks from anything resembling their old world. The colony in Sudan, the Mamluks who fled to Dongola after 1811, did not simply vanish into obscurity. They attempted to reconstitute something resembling their old political existence, however diminished, ruling over a stretch of Nile territory, with what remained of their households and retainers. It could not last. In 1820, Muhammad Ali launched a full military conquest of Sudan, and one of his stated justifications was the continued existence of this Mamluk remnant on his southern frontier, a threat he chose not to tolerate indefinitely, even 9 years after he believed he had already destroyed them. When Muhammad Ali's forces arrived, the Mamluk commander at Dongola, a bey named Abd al-Rahman, reportedly sent back a defiant refusal to surrender rather than accept terms. It didn't matter. The Sudan campaign ended what remained of organized Mamluk military resistance for good. Afterward, Muhammad Ali extended a pardon to the survivors and permitted them to return to Egyptian territory. Contemporary accounts suggest only around 80 of them actually took him up on the offer and crossed back north, a small remnant of what had once been hundreds of exiled fighters and their families, those absorbed into the new Egyptian administration in Sudan itself. Not every Mamluk who ended up in Sudanese territory arrived as a rebel. Some, whether captured, recruited, or simply pragmatic about where power now lay, ended up serving inside the very Egyptian administrative structure that had conquered them, becoming provincial governors and military officers on Muhammad Ali's payroll in Sudan's newly established provinces. A Mamluk named Mahu Bey Urfali, for instance, governed effectively enough during his brief tenure in the 1820s to earn a reputation for restoring order and easing tax burdens on local farmers, before being replaced at the whim of the same Egyptian court that had once hunted men like him. Their graves and memorial domes, known locally as kubas, still stand today along what is now called Abbas Avenue in Khartoum, physical monuments to a group who had gone, within a single generation, from being massacred as a class to administering the very territory that massacre was meant to secure. To those who ended up serving a European conqueror entirely by accident, perhaps the strangest individual survival story belongs to a boy who was never even part of the group massacred in 1811 at all, but whose life traces the same institutions, final unraveling from an entirely different angle. Rustam Raza was born around 1782 near Tbilisi in Georgia, kidnapped as a young teenager, and sold multiple times before ending up in the household of a Cairo bey, where he was trained as a Mamluk cavalryman in the traditional manner, just as generations of Circassian and Georgian boys had been before him. He missed the catastrophic Battle of the Pyramids in 1798 only because he happened to be on pilgrimage to Mecca with his owner at the time. After his master's death, he passed into the household of a prominent Cairo religious leader who gave him as a gift to the French general then occupying Egypt, Napoleon Bonaparte. Rustam followed Napoleon back to France in 1799 and spent the next 15 years as his personal bodyguard, sleeping outside his bedroom door on nearly every campaign from Austerlitz to Moscow. A living embodiment of Mamluk martial training now, serving the ambitions of a European emperor thousands of miles from Cairo when Napoleon was exiled to Elba in 1814. Rustam, newly married, chose not to follow him, one of the very few members of the imperial household to decline. He lived out his remaining decades quietly in provincial France, largely forgotten by the empire he had once guarded, and died in 1845. Those who were absorbed into Muhammad Ali's own household as a new kind of Mamluk, in one of the more uncomfortable ironies of the whole story. Muhammad Ali, the man who annihilated the old Mamluk Beylikate, went on to build his own household guard using the exact same slave soldier institution he had just destroyed, purchasing and training young Circassian and Caucasian men in essentially the traditional Mamluk manner to serve as loyal retainers within his own new dynasty. The practice persisted for decades among his successors. This inherited custom carried its own violent postscript. Later in the century, Muhammad Ali's grandson, the ruler Abbas I, was killed in 1854 under circumstances that many contemporary and historical accounts attribute to members of his own household staff, though the precise details and motives remain disputed among historians. Whatever the full truth of that specific episode, it underscores something remarkable: the institution. Muhammad Ali thought he had permanently eliminated in 1811, quietly reconstituted itself in miniature inside the palace of the very dynasty that destroyed it. Those who simply disappeared into ordinary life. Not every survivor became a governor, a bodyguard, or a rebel. The great majority of Mamluk dependents, widows, children, freed servants, distant relatives of the murdered beys, left almost no individual trace in the historical record at all. They shed the outward markers of their old identity, married into Egyptian families that carried no association with the old regime, and were absorbed into the general population of Cairo and the provinces within a generation or two. This is, in many ways, the least dramatic but most historically significant path of all, because it represents the true scale of what happened after 1811. Not a single tragic ending, but thousands of individual, mostly undocumented adjustments to a world that no longer had any room for the identity they had inherited. So did the Mamluks disappear? The honest answer is layered. The Mamluk Sultanate disappeared in 1517. The Mamluk Beylikate, the semi-autonomous ruling class that operated underneath Ottoman authority, was destroyed with brutal finality in 1811, and its final organized remnant crushed in Sudan by 1820 as a functioning political and military institution with real independent power. The Mamluks were gone for good after that, but the identity, the imagery, and even fragments of the bloodline scattered outward in ways that outlasted the institution itself by well over a century. In Sudan, the kubus of surviving Mamluk officials still stand in Khartoum, physical evidence of a group that ended up administering the territory their exiled kinsmen had once fled to and died defending. In France, the memory of Napoleon's Mamluk cavalry corps and figures like Rustam Raza fed directly into 19th century European Orientalist painting and fashion, with Mamluk-style uniforms, curved sabers, and turbaned cavalry becoming a recurring visual shorthand for exotic Eastern military glamour in French art. For decades, a romanticized, often historically loose image that had only a distant relationship to the actual slave soldier system it claimed to depict. In Egypt itself, the site of the Citadel massacre became eventually a tourist landmark, and the Mamluk era more broadly was gradually folded into a kind of national, historical mythology, remembered in popular culture less for the specific brutality of 1811, and more for an earlier, more heroic image, the cavalry that stopped the Mongols, the builders of Cairo's great mosques and mausoleums. That popular mythology is worth separating carefully from the documented history, the romanticized version of the Mamluks. as swashbuckling, glamorous warrior nobles, tends to skip past the fact that the entire system was built on the large-scale importation and enslavement of children from the Caucasus, generation after generation, for over 500 years. It also tends to compress two very different endings, the Ottoman conquest of 1517 and Muhammad Ali's massacre of 1811, into a single vague narrative of decline, when in fact the Mamluks proved resilient enough to survive and even flourish again after the first ending, only to be deliberately, permanently eliminated as an independent class in the second. The record shows an institution that was destroyed once, rebuilt itself as a shadow government for nearly 3 centuries, and only then was extinguished for good, through calculated violence rather than gradual decay. So what actually happened to the Mamluks after their world ended? Not one thing and not one ending. Their sultanate died in 1517, and their class endured anyway, ruling from the shadows of Ottoman Cairo for another 250 years. The Beylikat died in a stone corridor inside the Cairo citadel in 1811, and pieces of it still endured anyway, in a fugitive colony on the Nile, in a bodyguard's post beside a French emperor's bed, in a new ruler's own household guard, in unmarked graves and quiet second lives across 2 continents. The final judgment is this: the Mamluks were never simply conquered. They were a system built to survive its own leaders' deaths, generation after generation, by design, and that same resilience meant that even total military and political destruction couldn't fully erase them in a single stroke. It took 2 separate catastrophes, 300 years apart, and even then what disappeared was the institution, not every person who had once belonged to it. If a slave soldier could end up guarding an emperor's bedroom door, or governing the very province his people had fled to as refugees, what does that tell us about how thin the line really is between a conquered people and a surviving one? If you want more stories about what happens after the sword falls, subscribe to After the Sword. There's more history waiting on the other side of every ending.